Yes, light is very important. When we think about light, we might be thinking about the sun, we could be thinking about the lights in the studio, we could be talking about the flash you put on a camera. But for this week, I just want to focus on exposure. So when we talk about exposure, we're talking about the light that enters the camera and strikes our sensor and creates the exposure. So when we talk about exposure, we're talking about, hey, getting enough light into that camera. So welcome to the second video for week number 1. In this video, I'm going to just go over some of the takeaways. You've done the readings, at least you should have if you're watching this video, and you should have watched the videos on lynda.com. Hopefully you did all that. So when I say takeaways, what I mean is the learning outcomes or the things that I want you to have gotten out of those watching the videos and doing the readings. And I'll also point out things that are, you should be aware of, or at least know will be on any tests or midterms or exams and things like that that we have coming up in the next few weeks. Anyways, before I get into the takeaways, I should just talk about this camera a little bit. This is something we call a large format camera, and it's a black box just like your camera. And it has a lens on one end and an area where the image is projected on the back, or where the, in this case it would be film, but in your camera this would represent where the sensor is located. I'll be using this camera because it's bigger, and because it's bigger, it makes it a little bit easier for me to illustrate some concepts. And I can take the lens off, and there's things about the lens that make it a little bit easier for me to demonstrate things. So that's a large format camera. We'll come and take a look at that again. Anyways, the takeaways. So the first takeaway is that there are 2 ways of controlling how much light gets into that camera, and 2 ways of how light gets into your camera. The first thing that we'll talk about is this thing called the aperture. And the aperture is just a fancy word for a hole. And on your camera and this camera, we can make that aperture bigger and smaller. So changing that aperture allows more light to come through into the camera, or it can make less light enter the camera. So a bigger aperture, a larger hole, lets in more light. Smaller hole, smaller aperture, lets in less light. If you take a look at this video, I've removed a lens from one of our cameras, and I've got it mounted here, and it's aimed towards a window, and it's projecting an image onto this piece of paper. Well, what you see projected on this piece of paper is the image that would be projected onto your sensor. And this light striking the paper, that is the exposure that we're concerned with. Anyways, in this video, you can see my finger is turning this ring that's on the lens, and it's changing the aperture. It's making that hole bigger and smaller, and you can see the image on the paper getting darker and brighter. This is the lens that I was using in that video. It's a little bit different than your lens. On this lens, I can adjust the aperture by turning this ring that is on the lens. So that's aperture. The other way of controlling how much light gets into your camera is something we call a shutter. And you might hear people talk about shutter speed. Hey, what shutter speed are you using? Well, what is a shutter? Well, first I'll tell you there's 2 types of shutters, and there's a leaf shutter and a focal plane shutter, and they both do the same thing. They control how long light is allowed to enter the camera. So aperture controls how much light gets in, as in the area of the circle. Shutter controls time. How long is light allowed to enter? So as I mentioned, there are 2 types of shutters. In this large format camera, the shutter is built into the lens, and you can see a close-up of it here in this video. Your camera is different. Your camera uses what they call a focal plane shutter. You can think of it as a curtain that opens and closes. So you can see in this video the focal plane shutter opening and closing. So aperture and shutter speed are two ways of controlling how much light enters your camera. Adjusting the shutter speed, or the shutter, and adjusting the aperture are two ways of controlling the brightness of your image. There's one more way of controlling the brightness of your image, and that's something called ISO. The ISO determines how sensitive that sensor is to light. So ISO doesn't control how much light goes into the camera, but it does control the lower the ISO number needs, the less sensitive. The higher the number. Sometimes when people talk about the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed, they'll talk about the higher that number is, the more sensitive exposure triangle the sensor is. These are the three elements that control more sensitive exposure. It does not need as much light to come in. You can shoot in a darker room. One thing that I do want to get across, the ISO, and I guess it would be like another takeaway for this week, you need more light to know that there are standard settings. Your camera has extra numbers beyond these standard values, but I want us to get to know these standard values first. So there are standard values for the f-stop scale, standard ISO scale, and there's a standard shutter speed scale. And I just want us to take a look at all of them, because what I want you to do is start working at memorizing these numbers. And I'll give you some tips in a moment. We're going to start with the ISO scale though, because it's a little bit easier than the others. If you take a look at this slide, I'm showing you the standard ISO scale. The first number is 100, the second number is 200, and 400, and 800. What I need you guys to do is start memorizing these numbers. At some point on a quiz or on a midterm, not next week though, but probably in about 3 or 4 weeks, you should have these numbers memorized. So start working on it soon. So that's ISO. Next thing we'll talk about is shutter speeds. So these are the length of time that our shutter is open. And on my list here, I'm starting at 1 second. You would rarely use a shutter speed of 1 second, but we have to start somewhere, so I'm starting at 1 second. So 1 second, if we were to speed up the shutter to the next stop, the next shutter speed would be 1/2 of a second. If we were to slow down our shutter speed or adjust our shutter speed by another stop, that would be 1/4 of a second, and then 1/8, and 1/15, 1/30, 1/60, and so on and so forth. I need you to memorize these numbers as well. So these numbers are a little bit trickier, but if we take a look at the numbers, you'll see that there is a pattern. If you think about 1 second, that's a fraction of 1/1. So look at that bottom number. That's a 1. You double it, well now you have 2, 1/2. You take the 2 and you double it. That gives you 4, so 1/4. Take the 4 and double it, that's 8. Well, that's 1/8. Take the 8 and double it, and that's 1/16. Oh, but wait. This is one of those odd numbers. So instead of 1/16, it's 1/15. Just one of those numbers that's why I said shutter speeds are a bit trickier. So it's one of those numbers you're just going to have to give special attention to. And just remember, there's a bit of rounding off that has to happen. Then the pattern continues. If you look at 1/15, take that 15, you double it, you get 30, so 1/30. Take 30 and double it, and you have 60, so 1/60. Take 60 and double it, and you have 1/20, so 1/120. However, this is another area where there's some rounding off going on. So instead of 1/120, it's 1/125 of a second. So just another number you got to keep your eye on. Then the pattern continues. Take 1/25 and double it, and you get 250, so 1/250 of a second. Take 250, double it, you got 500. Double 500, you have 1,000. 2000s, 4000, 8000s, and there it goes. That's the pattern. So that's ISO and that's shutter speed. The third one is aperture. So these are something we call the F numbers. When people talk about apertures, they usually will say something like f2.8, f5.6. That's just the language. That's how we refer to the aperture sizes. So this is another series of numbers that I need you guys to start memorizing. And this is the one that's probably the trickiest. That's kind of why I saved it for last. So let's just take a look at these numbers and I'll just sort of explain a couple things. First number is f1, then it's 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5, 6. You can see the numbers there on the screen. Anyways, what's happening? When we go from f1 to 1.4, what's happening is the circle or the aperture is getting smaller. And it's getting smaller so that the area of that circle is half of what it was in the previous aperture. So f1, nice big hole. If you go down to 1.4, the hole gets a little bit smaller and the area is half the size, okay? Half the size means half the light is getting through. So just like ISO and just like shutter speed, we want to reduce the area by one stop, one half. And when we go from 1 to 1.4, that's exactly what we're doing. When we go from 1.4 to 2, we're doing the same thing. We're taking that hole and we're making it 1/2 the size, 1/2 the area. So 1/2 the light is getting through. Okay. So if we go the other direction, for example, if we're at 5.6 and we go to f4, we are doubling the area. So now twice as much light is getting through. So that would be a stop. Anyways, let's get back to this. Start memorizing these. This is tricky because it's not like the other numbers. The pattern's a bit weird. And if I look at these numbers, and maybe you're looking at them with me, and there's no pattern, or at least there isn't one, an obvious pattern. But if we take a look, there is a bit of a pattern going on. And if you take a look at this line here, it says the common factor is the root of 2. Okay, so what's the square root of 2? All right, well, that's, you can punch it into your calculator, but I'll tell you right now it's 1.4. If you take a look at number 1 and you multiply it by 1.4, you get 1.4. Okay. You take 1.4 and multiply it by 1.4, you get 2. If you take 2 and you multiply it by 1.4, you get 2.8. 2.8, multiply it by 1.4, and you're going to get 4. 4 times 1.4, you're going to get 5.6, and so on, and so on, and so on. So I'm just showing that to you to sort of answer the question, like, why is the pattern that way? How do those numbers progress? It's not going to help us memorize those numbers. So here's another way to help you memorize or think about how to progress to the next stop. Because there is a pattern. And that is a little bit easier for us to remember. And every second f-stop, the number doubles. So if I put my slide like this, you can see it a little bit better. So there I've bolded some of the numbers, and some of the numbers are light gray. And you can see all the numbers that are the same shade double, and the bold numbers double. So 1.4, double it, you get 2.8. 2.8, you double it, you get 5.6. 5.6, you double it, you get F11. Well, there's a bit of rounding off going on there too, so it should be 11.2, but in this case it's 11. So I don't know if that helps, but it might. When you get the test and you get the midterm, or when you do these midterms, I'm going to allow you to use a scrap piece of paper. And when you get that scrap piece of paper, the first thing you want to do is write out the f-stop scale. Start at any number you want. Start at 1.4 and just double it, double it, double it, and then in between those numbers, put the other numbers. That's one way of memorizing those numbers. So, aperture, shutter speeds, ISOs. We have to start memorizing these. If you go onto Fanshawe Online, I've given you a document that looks like this. Basically, what I've given you is it's a PDF that you can download and print off or fill in the blanks. If you download it, you can use Acrobat or Preview and you can actually fill in the blanks. But I start off the shutter speeds and I left these, the rest of the the column blank for you to fill in. There, I started off the f-stops or the apertures, and I just need you to finish the series. And I started a series of ISOs. Now, just for fun, I started at a lower number, but I just need you to finish the series. You don't have to hand this in. I'm providing that to you to help you get started on practicing and trying to memorize these numbers. It's like, think back in elementary school when you had to learn the times tables and maybe you used flashcards. I don't know, whatever it takes. I just need you to be able to finish this series. Anyways, that's all for now. Next week, we'll be talking about something we call reciprocity, and we'll start talking about light meters, and we're going to start talking about measuring light. And some of you will definitely have an aha moment. If you had any questions about why sometimes your pictures are too bright or too dark, we'll probably answer that next week. Anyway, thanks, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.